Welcome back for some more Skyrim with Requiem. I had been feeling kind of burned out and frustrated by Requiem lately just because I've been playing a lot of it and there are some design choices in there which were really starting to bug me. So based on some suggestions I got in the channel, I went looking for different overhauls and mods for Requiem to hopefully spice up the experience a little bit. And based on that, I came across the AZTweaks mod, which I have to say I'm really liking it so far. I'm not terribly far in at this point, but it seems great. I think it does a lot of good things compared to the base Requiem experience, and so I just wanted to make a video to talk a bit about what it changes and why, if you haven't heard of it before, you might want to give it a try. And I know this is not like a brand new mod. The developer made it back quite a while ago, but it has been updated somewhat regularly. So it's not exactly news, but at least for me personally, I've played a ton of Requiem and I had never happened across AZTweaks before, even though I had heard of it. I think part of that is just the name. When you hear tweaks, you think, well, it's just minor changes, right? Maybe just a few balance adjustments, but not anything really big. When in fact, AZTweaks makes a huge number of changes to the systems within Requiem, almost as much as Requiem changes the base game, I would say. So the purpose of this video, I'm just going to go over in a kind of big picture look at the systems that AZTweaks changes. So that's in particular the starting stats, your races, your birth sign or standing stone, and then the different divine blessings you can get. I'll talk a little bit about some of the changes it makes to the skill systems and the food, and a little bit about the combat and so on. And I'm still not terribly far into it, so I can't really comment on the late game balance and what it might do there. So this is not a definitive video by any means, but what I'm hoping to do is for people who may have heard of the mod but did not feel like going through and reading the manual in detail, just to give kind of a overall picture of what it's doing and why, if you're an experienced Requiem player, maybe you would consider giving it a shot. So, first off, what is the AZTweaks mod? It's a modification for the game. It requires you to have Requiem in version 1.9.4.1. Yes, no more, no less. It must be 1.9.4.1. Requiem's current version is 3.4, at least at the time of this video, and this mod will not work if you have Requiem versions 2, 3, anywhere beyond that. Just don't go there, you can't do it. There is another mod called AZTweaks, which is made by a different author, but I don't think it's all that similar to AZTweaks. So you need to have Requiem 1.9, and it also assumes that you're going to be using minor arcana and a few other smaller mods I would call like soul gem mods, which don't significantly impact the game, but I think are needed for compatibility reasons. Anyways, so the mod is for assuming you have Requiem and assuming you have the right version of it, and the original AZTweaks is designed for Skyrim Legendary Edition. I was able, with a bit of work and some research, to get it working for Special Edition, so that's what this particular playthrough is on. But if you do it on just old Skyrim, you'll have quite a bit easier time of installing it. So what does the AZTweaks mod do? First, let's talk about the changes to the racial abilities. So Requiem changes the vanilla races to make them quite a bit more distinct from each other, and then AZTweaks pushes that even further. And I'm not going to go over specific stats. You can read the manual if you're really interested in hearing about all of that. I want to keep it more at a big picture look, but there are two big conceptual changes that AZTweaks makes compared to Requiem. The first is that there are no more racial powers. So for example, in Requiem, the Altmer have the Highborn power to regenerate magicka. That is now gone in AZTweaks, and instead there are much more significant passive differences between the different races, which I think will affect quite a bit more of how they play. So instead of having the Highborn bonus, the High Elves have just more spell-related bonuses, more magicka to accomplish a similar feel, which is that they're powerful spellcasters, but not having it be a once-a-day sort of power. And I really like this change because, at least for me personally, I found that I rarely used the racial powers once you get past the earliest stages of the game. I would just forget to use them, and between switching between various different shouts and stuff, you end up spending a lot of time in your menus if you're trying to use the racial powers really consistently. So I'm pretty happy to have those just move to be a passive bonus toward each of the races. The second big conceptual change in the racial abilities that I found in AZTweaks is the magic abilities of each race are kind of thematically altered. And what do I mean by that? There's kind of a distinct casting style for each race, assuming you decide to invest into magic. So just to give an example, I'm playing as a Khajiit character here, and when playing as a Khajiit, if you cast spells dual casted, you get a bonus to them of reduced cost, higher power, and so on. So it kind of incentivizes you to play the game a certain way, which is dual casting spells. And that kind of leads you into some interesting gameplay decisions because, well, at least personally, I rarely use dual casted spells when I was playing Skyrim normally because it's just not all that efficient, right? Your casting cost goes up, but you don't get all that much more power out of it. But with the bonus that the Khajiit have to it, suddenly dual casting spells can make a lot of sense. And then some of the other races, the abilities, like for example, the Dark Elves have magic that is more expensive but also more powerful. The Orcs have less costly magic that is a little bit weaker. The Bretons have their spells last longer, so it makes them a little bit better at conjuring. And the Nords get a bonus to reduce cost when their magic is full, so if you just wanted to cast a big buff effect, you'd have an easier time doing it with a Nord, and so on. So I really like the decision to do that because rather than just having some small stat changes to each race, there are actually pretty big differences in how you would go about playing it depending on your passive racial ability, and instead of having a once every day power, which you'll maybe have up like 1% of your total playtime, your racial abilities will actually affect how you play the game all the time. The second big area where AZTweaks is different for character creation is in the standing stones or birth signs. The AZTweaks mod goes back to an older school version of birth signs where you pick one at the start of the game and then you stick with it as you continue through. You can't change it later on. And overall, the changes to the standing stones, I think they're less dramatic than the changes to the races, but they are still pretty noticeable, and I think on average make the standing stone abilities a bit stronger. And they continue with that same philosophy of instead of having one-use powers, they give you a stronger passive bonus. So for example, the Ritual Stone, instead of letting you do a Resurrect ability, instead it lets you have one additional summoned necromantic minion all the time, as well as some magicka boosts. So if you're wanting to play as, say, a necromancer, then the Ritual will assist you in your playthrough all the time instead of just being able to use their one-time ability just occasionally, which is not all that noticeable. And this is another change that I like quite a bit because, again, it alters your playstyle in a more noticeable way. I also found that when I was playing base Requiem, that often it just felt like there weren't, even though there were technically 10 or 13 actually different standing stones, there were only a few that were actually useful, and for most of my playthroughs with it, I ended up picking either like the Warrior Stone or the Mage Stone and just going through with it all the time, maybe switching over to the Atronach Stone or something very late game, or the Lord Stone. But with AZTweaks, well, for example, the Apprentice Stone is something that I don't think I would ever have considered using in base Requiem, but now, because it gives a flat amount of base magicka regeneration, I can think of some cool builds where that would actually be a useful thing to have. A third area where the AZTweaks mod changes up Requiem are in the Blessings of the Divines. And you may already be familiar with the Requiem systems where in order to keep the divine blessings, you have to avoid crime and other specific actions like murder or worship of Daedra and so on in order to get shrine blessings. But it's pretty underwhelming in some ways because you do all this work in changing how you play your character, but the blessings you get are actually not all that significant within Requiem. that's changed within this mod because each of the divines has a much more fleshed out system for what you have to do, and actually also what you get for maintaining a good status with them. So just for example, the character I'm playing now, I'm intending to do it as a worshiper of Julianos, the god of knowledge, and typically used by wizards. So Julianos is very intolerant of any sort of crimes against property. You can't do trespassing, and it favors collecting books and spells and rewards you with more magicka, magic regeneration, and resistance if you follow those rules. And in general, each of the divines seems to have kind of a mini quest attached with it. So for Julianos, it's searching up specific books, which will increase the blessing you gain from him. For Mara, it's searching for Nirn roots. For Kinnereth, it's hunting for animals, and so on. And the blessings you get from the divines include some bonus to both your offensive and defensive skills. Typically, it will buff your resistance in some ways or make you harder to kill, and also give you some kind of an offensive bonus. I was thinking about doing this character as one built around Stendarr, because as you worship Stendarr and kill more Daedra, you get increased movement speed. As you clear dungeons, you get more magicka and more armor rating and all these good things. So there's a lot of different ways you can build out your character if you're willing to put up with the restrictions of worshiping the divines and staying away from the Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood. And it's also worth noting that there's another further mod you can get for this, which allows you to worship the Daedric princes, where if you wanted to have a character that was evil but still had some sort of system like this, you could do that. I'm not personally using that because it doesn't really fit what I'm trying to do with this character anyways, and I think that if you're going in the Dark Brotherhood Thieves Guild route, you get quite a bit of power regardless. So from a balance standpoint, I don't think it's really necessary to have worship be available for quote-unquote evil characters. But if you wanted that, it is available to you if you add the Daedric worship mod on to the AZTweaks system. So let's bring it all together for a second. Between the different racial abilities, the standing stone abilities, and then finally choosing a divine that you want to research or to worship, well, there's 10 races, 10 divines, and 13 different stones. So in theory, there's 1,300 distinct builds that you could come up with, each of which would have differing passive abilities and would somewhat alter your way of approaching the game in order to have the most optimal character that you could. And this is something that I really like because I have kind of a natural inclination toward doing at least a little bit of min-maxing in my characters. And it's nice when, even in the course of min-maxing, you can get a legitimate justification to have some kind of a meaningful roleplay. So for this particular character, because I want to keep the favor of the divines, I'm staying away from some quests that I might otherwise consider doing, and for example, not having access to stuff like the Dark Brotherhood gear changes how I'm going to approach gearing out this character as I go through the early game. So I'm pretty excited about the changes and the amount of customization that allows. A fourth area that has changed are some significant alterations to the perk trees within Requiem. And I'm going to stay away from going into great detail here because that could turn into a very, very lengthy part of this video. And again, just try and hit the high points. And basically there's a couple of new perks added to a lot of the different trees. And one big theme of that I noticed is that the defensive perks that you really want to get things like magic resist, which is pretty essential to have for late game Requiem content, it's now scattered throughout more different perk trees and it's less focused in particular ones, because in base Requiem you pretty much have to be in alteration if you want to get a lot of magic resist out of your tree, and you can still get some out of alteration, but it's also with the tweaks mod been added into, you can get a little bit from your enchanting skill, from your smithing skill, from your heavy armor skill, and so on, that will all give you small buffs to your magic resistance, making it more viable if you didn't want to go into an alteration character to still get those defensive bonuses. And so without saying too much about the perk tree, because it really is quite large, the other thing I like about it is that there are actually some incentives to not do particular parts that you might choose if you were just purely metagaming out your tree. And one aspect of that is they've added in a treatise system. So in other words, you have to have picked up a skill book for a lot of the trees. If you want to take any of the crafting or any of the magic trees, you have to find yourself a treatise, which they're located where skill books used to be. Skill books no longer exist in AZTweaks. But after you have the treatise for an appropriate skill, you can then take the first perk into it. And you get one free starting perk into a magic tree. So for this particular character, I took Destruction as my initial perk, but now if I want to get my Conjuration or Restoration or so on, I have to either go find myself one of those books or buy it from a merchant. So it's not particularly restrictive because they're not terribly hard to get from a merchant, but it does give you some minor barrier to just picking lots of different one-off perks just to get a bonus when you particularly need it. There's also some incentive to, if you're not going to use any magic or any crafting, you actually get a small buff for not taking any perks there. If you don't unlock any magic trees, then you get a scaling health buff. And if you don't take any crafting perks, you get a steady buff to your bartering ability, which I think is kind of a nice touch, because I like the option to play Requiem without doing a lot of crafting. I think it keeps the flow of the game going faster, but it always felt like you were pretty heavily restricting your power. And I'm sure it's still the case that by not doing crafting that you are limiting your character somewhat, but I appreciate that there can actually be a legitimate reason for gameplay to actually have that sort of a restriction on yourself. Last area that I'll talk about that is tweaked by this mod is in the food and poultices that you can get. So Requiem adds healing poultices to give you an alternate option to get some health regen. In the Tweaks mod, you can actually take some perks to make poultices more effective. You can also get them to improve your stamina or your magicka regen, and the food system has been heavily overhauled. There are different types of food that you can eat, which will give you some amount of regeneration of your different stats. So there's actually a pretty good reason to carry around some food and eat it as you go in between combat. And I personally am not a big fan of needs mods. I feel like they just add an extra layer of micromanagement, but I think this is a pretty good in-between, because you could, in theory, get by without ever eating any food, but you'd just be making yourself a little bit weaker. And I think this is a pretty interesting approach to it. And that system is very, very in-depth, beyond the scope of this video, but I'll just say that I like the approach that the mod author has taken here. So what's the big picture look on AZTweaks? I think for people who are kind of veterans of Requiem and want a little different take on it, this is a nice way to get that. I think that it overhauls a lot of the things that I found kind of annoying about Requiem, and while I'm not deep enough into it yet to say whether it fixes some of the late game balance issues, I can say that I'm really liking how it feels for the early game. So I'm looking forward to continuing the playthrough with this mod, so stick around if you're interested in seeing more content as I continue to push through my journey into Requiem with the AZTweaks mod. You can check out my full mod list in the description of the video, and hit subscribe if you'd like to be notified as I post more content on this. I think it'll be a pretty long-running series because I want to take this character pretty far into the game. So thank you for watching this far, and if you have any comments or your own experiences playing the AZTweaks mod and anything in particular you think goes well with that, I'd be very curious to hear about it. So see you in the next one.